So today we're going to be talking about watercolor and get you started on a watercolor technique chart. To begin with, I wanted to show you a variety of ways that you can purchase watercolor in sets. So here are a couple standards. This one is very similar to what you were given as part of your supplies. Comes with a single little brush. This one's got two pop-out palettes so that you can hold it and kind of extend that space there. This is also what we call a cake one. So the set that you got has little cakes, and sometimes you can buy ones where they are replaceable. This one is where they are already kind of put in there for you. And I really love this set. The intensity of the color of this set is pretty fantastic. And I'll show you some examples of that in a moment there. This one I got on Amazon. But just a really huge range of colors here. And a lot of people like to use tube watercolor. And this is kind of a pretty traditional way to actually purchase your watercolors is in tubes. You can do physical mixing like we've been doing with our acrylics, but you can also let them kind of dry and they can be a lot like the cakes. This set is a Cotman cake, the Winsor Newton. This also has a palette that can pop out. Let's see if I can get this part. That one's in there pretty good. But it also can attach and really extend out and comes with one single brush as well. When you have the liquid versus the cake, you can also use different types of palettes. So these ones are great for traveling. You know, this set that you have, folds up, put it in your purse, put it in your backpack, travels really easily with you. These ones do as well, slightly bigger, but you have a whole, palette and colors with you as well. A couple other sets that I want to show you. Clear these out. Include something like this. This palette itself is about $10, and it comes without any of the colors in there. So you would take your pre-bought little tube paints and fill it in with the tubes that you have. So I used the same Cotman set that we see here to fill this one. And I like this because it's really flat and slick that way. This also has a two palette system. So we have a mixing palette here, but this also has that see-through tray, which really gives you three separate areas that you can mix and build your colors in. Okay, so these are that's just another variation. We also have a pretty traditional tray setup that would be standard if you have a home studio. And this comes with a lid, so you can see here, that helps it stay wet, can travel. These can come even larger than what you see here. This is also built up using the tube paints, and they're put down into the trays, and then you do your mixing in this big area here. So I've seen these, the size of our tabletop as well. Again, this is a smaller set, but it allows you to have a lot of pigment in here. Oftentimes you'll hear that when you're using the tube watercolor paint that you shouldn't let it dry, that you should use it as it is wet to get more movement and fluidity within your watercolor. I find that there's something nice about using the tubes when they are wet, but also when they dry like this, they're very similar to what we have in our cakes. And so it's just a different approach to mixing physically two wet paints, just like we're doing with our acrylics, or mixing them using the water and on the palette itself. And we'll demonstrate a couple different ways that we can do that. So the main part of today's demo, I'll be using my small set that is very similar to what you have, so that you can see how things are going to work for you based off of same types of materials. Now your set came with a tiny brush. You also should have bought a 3/4 inch or a 1 inch brush as well. While having more brushes is great, this is kind of the bare minimum that you will want to have for not only your chart here, but as you are using watercolor in our couple in-class assignments and then in your sketchbook. So I want to show you first just a little bit the intensity of the set that I talked about, and then I will pull out the liquid watercolors as well, and so you can see some of that kind of physical mixing that can happen too. When you're setting up your space, make sure that you always have 2 containers of water. One's always going to be kind of your clean water that you'll use for washes and things, and one is the dirty waters. So make sure that you always have that, and of course change that as is necessary. Alright, so again I'm going to use those same types of brushes that you guys have and just show you some of these great colors that exist in this set. What's nice about it is that they're already basically pre-mixed for you. So something like this is a really great, intense, yellow-green, high saturation. We've got some really nice blues as well, and I just love all the colors. They're purples. They're just colors that we will not be able to mix with this kind of intensity. You can see that I'm adding more water as I go, so you can kind of see how those blend out. Some of these reds and fuchsias, same types of things. So this is a lot like a permanent rose that we can buy, but it's not necessarily in our set. And some really nice intense greens here too. Rich coloration. So sometimes we talk about sets that are relatively inexpensive, might not have that same pigment saturation and included in there, but I found that this set really does. I mean, these pigments hold out or hold up. So if we think about watercolor itself, it is made with pigment, and then gum arabic, which is a tree sap, is what holds it together. That's our binder and our pigment. And so like we talk about with our acrylic, where you want to make sure that you have more pigment than you do binders and fillers, this set has a lot of pigment in it. So it's really great, very comparable to what we would find in our little sets here. Okay, so that's why I really like this one. Now to look at what it's like when we have the kind of wet on wet mixing, let me trade out this and bring in some of those tube watercolors. So you can see here that I've got them set where I've already have some that have dried. So I'm just going to kind of resaturate some of these with fresh, and so you can kind of see that. So it comes out, it's really gooey. If I use it without even water, you can kind of see it's kind of sticky, tacky there. If I add the water in it, suddenly it's very movable. This is create that solution, and then we get really highly intense coloration. Now, if I use that same color in the dried one, I just need to take the water and kind of reconstitute what I've done before. And we see that we get a very similar result. It's a little dirty from sitting there. But in that case, the saturation, the color, the intensity is still there. When you have it when it's still wet, then we can do some physical mixing with the pigment on our, here. We can do that physical mixing right on our palettes versus, I'll show you that difference. So again, I've got some of that blue here. Wash my brush because I'm going to go pick up some of that yellow, and I don't want them to be mixing on the palette, so I'm going to get some of that fresh out of the tube. And then here I can do mixing just like we would with our acrylics. I'm going to need a little bit of water because we need that to help with that movement. And so then I can go thick and do dry brush, which we're going to talk about in a second. Or if I add more water, more of my to it, then I get the, whoop, almost, that fluidity that we are kind of used to seeing there. I'm working on a cold press paper here, and so cold press versus hot press really deals with how much texture is in there and when they were making the papers. So again, this is a color that I have physically mixed those two together, but I can also, if I have it where I'm taking from my dry cakes or here from my dried liquid ones, that I can pull, I can add water to it, I can get from over here and make that mixing happen even once they are reconstituted. And how much water you have really depends on that fluidity of the paint itself and that intensity of color too. So the less water I have, the more pigment is going to stay in that mix, and the more water I have, then of course it's going to make those particles of pigment spread out further, lighten the value, and it just means we'll have to do more layers on top. Okay, so we're going to set up with our small set, and we're going to do a full chart with a few different approaches that you can use for watercolor that really are the basis that all full compositions can be made off from. So let's go ahead and do that. Alright, so for doing your technique chart, there's a few materials that you're going to need. Number one, you're going to need some plastic wrap. Okay, so you just need a small piece of that. You should have that laying around. You will also need either some iodized salt, or I have some coarse sea salt. Either one will work. That's one technique that we're going to be doing. You will also need a crayon or two. So I'm going to show you some resist with white and then other colors just to show you some variations. You are going to be creating this in your sketchbook, or you may choose to take a small piece of one of your big watercolor pieces of paper and do this as well, and that's fine too. I can understand wanting to do that because you'll get more of an idea of how the watercolors work on true watercolor paper. In your sketchbooks, it's going to absorb a little bit differently. So either one is fine, but just know that there's going to be a little bit of difference with the way that your sketchbook paper works versus the watercolor paper. Again, I've got this on watercolor paper, and what I have done, my sheet is about 10 inches by 14, so I've got approximately a 2 by 3 little square that, or rectangle, that I've made for each one of these techniques. And so you'll want something about the same size. If you're doing this in your sketchbook, this may take a couple of pages, and that's fine too. All right. So we have 8 techniques that we're going to try today. There are plenty of other ones out there as well, but these are kind of some of the basic ones, and then a couple little tricks that we can do. All right, and so we're going to be not just necessarily going right down the row here, because some of them we need to actually kind of sit and dry for us, and so you'll see me kind of moving around here as we go. All right, first thing we are going to do, however, is our flat, and then flat with a glaze. Your goal here with the flat is we're going to try to get a bit of color going all the way across that has no gradation to it. So like if you look at these ones here, we can see where the water has kind of stained and dried and moved. This would not be considered a flat. We want something that has no gradation in that color whatsoever, that is just a flat standard color going all the way across. So we're going to do that both for the flat and the flat glaze, because we need that flat one to dry, that layer to dry, so we can see what it looks like when we glaze over top of it. Now you're welcome to choose whatever color you want for any of these, and I would say choose a variety so you see how each pigment looks on the paper. For these I'm going to do, I think, probably what's our equivalent of our CAD red, especially for the glaze. I want to see a couple different things that's going to happen with that. So I'm going to try to do these mostly with my 3/4 inch brush. And the key really when you are doing a flat wash all the way across is that you want to make sure, number one, that you make enough of basically that base pigment for yourself to use. And so I'm just making sure, you can see this kind of CAD red over here has a lot of orange to it. I want to make sure that I am making enough that I'm going to be able to do this whole rectangle and not have to add water into this or remix. And so I'm just going to keep going. I don't want too much water. I want enough that my paint color is even in there. Again, that I have enough created, but that I'm going to be able to fill that whole space. All right, and so our key here is going to be that we want to not have pooling, that we want to have, so see right now how it's pooled? I want to make sure that I'm pulling that around before my color dries, before my paint dries, so that there isn't one area that has more water or more pigment than the other. And if I find I have too much water in an area, I can kind of dab my brush and then make sure I pull this across. And you can see how I'm continually changing direction so that that color, those pigments, are not pooling in one area, that they're continuing. We don't want to overwork it, but we also want to make sure that it's relatively the same throughout. Okay, I'm going to go back to my base here, and I'm going to do the same thing over here, and we're going to let that one dry. And let me move these on my way a little bit. And we're going to let this one dry so that we can do some glazes over top, and again, see what that looks like. So I want to make sure that my color and water, the pigment in the water, are evenly spread. You can see once again I've got some pooling, and continue to change direction, going back and forth, dab some of that extra off of my brush, come back over here, even that out, and get a nice flat wash throughout. I see it's a little thick. I'm going to pull that around. All right, so that's flat. We see that there's no color change from top to bottom within the whole space of that area, that it is consistent. I don't have pooling of water in there. And with our flat and our glaze, we're going to, again, we have that same start, and we're going to see what some of that physical color on color is going to do versus later when we have some wet into wet. Okay. Next one we're going to do is going to be the salt one, because we're going to have to let that dry a little bit to see the full effect. All right, so I'm going to do it with a little bit of the iodized salt and a little bit of the sea salt, so you can see what that difference is with the coarseness. I'm also going to change colors because, you know, we want a variety. So I think I'm going to do this in one of my blues. Because our palette is kind of small, I'm going to clean that as I go. Make sure that you have plenty of paper towel around for yourself as you're doing this, because that will get saturated pretty quickly as well. Okay, so once again I'm going to be taking my large flat. This is going to be our ultramarine kind of equivalent. And I'm going to clean my brush just a little bit better because that is going to be end up making some dirt there. Alright, so do it over here. So we get that intensity of the blue. Again, you see I'm dabbing my little cake, bringing the pigment over here. This one is not as big of a deal. We're not going for flat. We're going to be seeing what the salt will do. So I'm going to bounce back and forth between my pigment and this. And I want to make sure that this one is a little bit, has a little bit more water as I'm putting it down. So you can see here, I've got pooling. That's okay. Again, we're going to have this one be just a little bit wetter because we want to see what that salt's going to do. Once you have that on there, we're going to take a little bit. So here's our coarse salt. Remember, the coarse salt is going to be some big pieces. You can already see how it's starting to absorb. It's going to make some really nice effects. And then we're going to do that with our iodized salt as well, which just has smaller granulations. So we'll put some of that down. So when you do this, you're going to go ahead and do a little bit in that whole area. And we're going to leave that be, and we're going to let that dry. And so you'll see, as you're watching the video, you'll be able to watch this kind of slowly change as we do some of these other areas. Okay. The next one I'm going to do is our plastic wrap down here. And so I'm going to take a little bit of my plastic wrap, find my end. Don't need a very big piece because we just need to put it right over here. And I'm going to use, since I have some of this blue, I'm going to put that in some of it, a fair amount of water. And then I'm going to go ahead and do a little bit of my red. There's going to be some wet into wet physical mixing, but I want to see what they do. So this is close to our alizarin crimson, and I'm going to go ahead and put that there. And while it's still wet, I'm going to put my plastic wrap on there. You can see already some interesting things happening. Let's squish that up just a little bit more, and we'll see. Okay, so that also needs to dry, so we're going to let that be. Okay, I'm going to move back up here to our gradated and our dry brush. So gradated means we're basically going from, it's a gradation of color. We're going to go from one hue to another and let them physically blend in the middle here. I'm going to clean up my space. So this we might want to do across an object. You might want this in a sky if you're thinking about having it go from light to dark, if it's a sunset. You know, there's a variety of applications that can happen with this. I'm going to do it with, I think, maybe we'll do some yellow to blue to see how that looks with the green that will be made, that secondary that'll be made in the end. So I'm going to get some of my cad yellow that is here, the cad yellow light. You use a fair amount of water as I'm doing this. And I'm going to build that here. And I don't want to physically mix on my palette. We can. You know, I'm using colors pure from the cakes. When you are making your pieces, of course, you're going to do a lot of physical mixing here. But for our demo, we're going to keep things just kind of straight out of the tube equivalent. All right, so for my gradated, I'm going to put the yellow on top, and I want to make sure that, again, I have enough water, and I'm going to go about halfway down with that. I'm going to go ahead and clean my brush. I'm going to get my blue, get some of that out, make sure I have enough water from that too, and I'm going to start from the bottom and do a nice coat across. And then I'm going to slowly let those two meet in the middle. And you can see where we're getting some physical mixing. Because they're so wet into wet, might be a little too wet. You see we've got that physical green that's happening in the middle, and slowly going up to our yellow there. So it's a wet into wet technique, but it's about that idea of gradating, that slow gradation from one color to another. We can also do this with just one hue too. So in your own, you know, we can go from a blue that has a lot of pigment, and we can slowly build that out through more water, etc. as well, and have a gradation just of one color too. Okay, but I want for you, for your demonstration exercise, to go from one color to another and see that physical mixing that happens. This is using one hue and using that white of the paper to have that gradation occur. All right, when we talk about dry brush, I'm going to move to our tiny brush here. Clean up my palette slightly. And when we do dry brush, we're thinking about using less water and just the pigment itself. Because we have a cake set, we really, we need the water to get the colors themselves to kind of activate those cakes. But what you want to do is make sure that you are using more pigment than you are water. You can see how this is sitting much more up and above, where this is kind of a puddle because we have a lot of water. So I'm going to keep going back and forth, and right now I can see that my cake, it feels kind of sticky. I can just tell from the brush that it feels sticky. It's hard for the pigment to move. That's our dry brush, and when I go across here, you'll see that I get these nice textures that occur. If I add more water, then there's more fluidity and less of that dry brush that happens. So if I do that with my large brush, I just get a different mark because of the size of the brush and the shape with that flat tip. So this is great to mimic textures that you see on forms and landscapes, all those types of things. So less water, more pigment, enough water to activate your cakes, but not so much that you get that pooling or that physical blending, that it's more of that pigment. And then you really pick up those textures that are on the surface itself. Okay, and they're really great. It's really a lot of fun of a technique to use. And you can do that too with your, we can do this with our acrylic paints too, in oils. So where you're just using less water, more of that pigment, and balancing it out, and you can have dry brush techniques even with your acrylics also. Okay. So our gradated and wet into wet are going to feel very similar, but there's different ways that we use each one. And so let's see what we can do. I'm going to go back to the little brush, I think. Actually, I'm going to do, I'm going to start with the wet and wet and just doing some pools of water. And I'm going to make kind of some circles here. So I'm going to have a circle right there, and then kind of one over here. And I know you guys can't see that so much in the video, but believe me, I'm just making kind of pools of water. And then I'm going to take some of the red and just dip that in there. And you can see how it's going to flow within there. If I have more water within my red itself, you'll see how that's going to travel in that pool of water. And it's one thing that's kind of fun about watercolors. It's just kind of alive, and the way that the water moves and the fluidity of it can create a lot of really interesting things. All right, so this one next to it, I'm going to do kind of more pigment in there so you can see a little bit more. And then if I just add more water, you can see how I can manipulate where that pigment is going. So it's another way to use the water itself to move and manipulate those forms. That's one wet into wet. And then what we did up here was also that wet into wet, where we get these gradations, we get a physical mixing that occurs as well. Okay. And oftentimes, you know, we'll want this to occur. We can keep building on this. And so, you know, if I have the blues here, you saw how that moved right into it. It was fantastic. Do that down here as well. And they'll start to absorb. And you can just watch that pigment. You know, the pigment particles are just floating in the water. And so they start to move and manipulate. You can get some nice abstractions and things that happen with that too. But again, this is a wet into wet. This is another wet into wet type of technique. Just a little bit different approaches. All right, with our resist here, I'm going to do part of it with the white crayon and then part of it with the colored crayon. And what you will find sometimes you want to use the white crayon for is because when you're doing watercolor, anytime you want white, you have to leave the white of the paper. And that's why it's really important to really plan out your drawings, that if you know if an area needs to be light or if you need a white highlight, you need to circle that or and make sure you paint around it. Sometimes you can put white crayon on that spot and know that you won't paint on that because this is going to resist over because of the wax in the crayon. We also have watercolor medium that is a masking fluid, and because you guys don't have access to that, I didn't show you this here. But you can put a masking fluid down that kind of works almost like a rubber cement, and you can put that where you want the white of the paper to go and paint around it. And once you pull that off and peel it off, the white of the paper is there, and where your paint has dried around it, it stays that white. So a lot of watercolorists use this to just help them keep in check. They can be more expressive then, and but know that they can keep the whites of the paper. So I'm just going to make some design with the white here, and then I'm going to also do some with the red so that you can actually see what it looks like. And of course with the red, that coloration, that pigment's going to stay. With the white, I'll keep that white of the paper. Okay, so again, because this is the, let's see, let's use some of our dark blue, So the wax and the water are not going to play nice together. And so there you can see where I had that white crayon. Suddenly now we can see it. And of course it'll be the same thing with the red crayon, but the red itself will stay. Let's get a little more pigment in there. It's a little light. Going way out of the lines today here. All right, so that is what's going to happen with the white crayon and then with the colored crayon. It resists it. That wax and water, they don't mix, and so the water is going to bead off of that. All right, so we're going to let this dry. We're going to come back in a few minutes and we'll do our reveal of our plastic wrap, and we'll see how that salt turns out. You can already see some really great, interesting textures and things forming from that. Alright, so we've let these dry a little bit, and so we're going to do some of our reveal. Now here in the salt, I'm going to push away the salt itself, and you can see that the salt pushes away and absorbs the water, and so you get these really great textures that can occur. So if you want something, you know, in the water that makes it look watery and wavy and that there's a lot of movement, this is a great way to do that. So putting that salt on there, letting it dry completely, brushing it away, and then you get that there. We're going to remove our plastic wrap, which is still a little wet, but not too bad. And you can see, you know, you get these great areas where it's puckered into, the wet water has puckered into certain areas. So you've got really these nice gradations of colors. So we've got really light areas, we've got darker. Because we use the two tones, we've got this, you know, wet into wet that's happening, so this physical mixing of color as well. So there's a lot of texture, again, a lot of movement. You can use this technique for rocks and areas that, again, that you want a lot of texture happening. Our wet into wet here, you can see that they are bleeding into each other. They're holding some of their own shape as well, but that pigment continues to spread out. So where we put the pigment right into just the water droplets, it spreads out, has this nice gentle gradation, and then with the other ones have kind of seeped their way into. All right, the last thing we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and do that glaze, and so that's the one thing that we didn't finish right up here. And so we want to use one of our flat brushes for this. We can try it with both actually. And so we're just going to see, this is where we oftentimes with watercolor, it's really about building from the back forward. And so you can do a lot of slow glazing throughout a whole piece and really building from lights to darks, because as you can see, once you put that pigment down, you can't subtract it away. So I really, the biggest advice that you can give with watercolor is, one, have a really strong drawing first, that you have all those major forms, and two, that you build from lights to darks. Okay, so we have this pretty much a almost mid value here. That's fine. We're going to build on top of that. But when you're doing a full glazing piece, really think about how you're going to build from lights to darks. So I'm going to go ahead and do just some of our kind of alizarin crimson over that, and then a green as well, just to see some differences. So I'm going to go ahead and put that color right over top, and you're going to see how we're going to get visual mixing versus physical mixing. I'm going to do this with some of our blue too. And again, depending on how much water you put in there with your pigments will also change how that transparency is. So remember, our blues and oranges are complements. So this should become and look kind of grayish. And let's see with a little bit of our kind of intense green on there and see what that looks like. And so when you do yours, think about doing the same thing. Think about 3 different color variations that you can do. And I'm trying to do mine fairly even in their approach. And of course I could let this dry and then do more on top and more on top, and you can see how that physical layering and mixing changes the initial flat wash color, how the glaze color adjusts and changes, and then with each subsequent layer, the same type of thing. All right.